Thank you. I've titled this Looking Back to Move Forward, and I think this has kind of been a theme that we've heard throughout the morning so far. And I think you'll understand what I mean when we get there. I imagine the discovery of indigo by humans, and who knows how long ago, thousands of years ago, as a discovery of pure amazement. Plucked from the plant and squished, the indigo so long concealed in the leaves comes into contact with the air and oxidizes, turning blue. The squished leaves wash off, but that blue remains, a reminder of how we, fundamentally as humans, have engaged with, learned from, and evolved because of the world around us. And in a primal way, this really gets at the heart of my own interest in natural dyes, and indigo in particular, that through the discovery of the colors concealed in plants, and through the process of transferring that color to cloth, I have a window through which to rediscover the world that I inhabit. It's a simple premise that, like whoever it was who discovered the blue hidden in indigo leaves thousands of years ago, I'm exploring, charting my relationship to the world I inhabit in ways that are at once old and yet new. But I'm not really here today to talk about my artwork, which I could go on and on about. I'm going to talk about indigo and the process of that. But first, a quick digression about how I got to where I am. That's me in 1993. It's not that life began at graduation from college. It's just a convenient place to start. I still wish I had that coat. So after graduation from college, I went to Japan to teach English. I was at a large public high school there, teaching at a public high school there. I had a very strong interest in photography, so I started a club at the high school and taught students how to develop and print black and white. I was placed I was living in this sort of Soviet-style bunker apartment that the school owned, and all around me there were these abandoned farmhouses. So using local connections, I was able to find an abandoned farmhouse, fix it up, moved in, and ended up living there for 3 years, cooking with fire, very, very simple existence. And there are two things that I learned from living in this house that have been really strong, ongoing influences in my work, and in many ways are the reasons why I do what I do today. The first of those is the impact of my own life, my day-to-day living, and the photography work I was doing on the immediate environment. And I learned this because the kitchen in this house had a sink, and the drain was a hole in the wall. So I turned on the water would run, and where's my water going? I went outside, followed it through this little trough right into the stream next to my house. I did a little asking. There was no primary water treatment in rural Japan at this time in the 90s. So all the things we were putting down the drain at the high school were all going down the drain, out of sight, and into the river. The other thing that I learned from living in this house is the idea of materials from the immediate environment that were in the house itself. This house was about 150 years at the time, maybe so about a 170-year-old house now, still standing. A friend of mine's living in it now. And this was built with all local materials. So the wood that was used was harvested locally, because you won't want to haul these big timbers far away. The rock for the foundation was all from the stream right next to it. The clay walls, the clay was locally harvested. The straw that was used in holding the clay together, all from local rice fields. You get the idea. So my home in Japan, this place was a real juxtaposition to my upbringing in suburban America. And my experiences living there really opened my eyes to the ideas that you can make profoundly beautiful things, homes, tools, utensils, meals, with materials from just outside your door. And really, this is the historical root of craft, is it not? In in light of our contemporary means of manufacture, which we've talked a lot about this morning, these historical materials and processes carry meaning in and of themselves. When my teaching contract was up there, I was very fortunate to be able to set up a 2-year apprenticeship in growing and processing indigo. I didn't want to just return to the States having lived in Japan for a couple years. I felt like when I come back, I want to bring something back that's really meaningful. And all my interests sort of converged in indigo. So I moved I'll go there in a second. I worked with a farmer for a year learning to grow and process the dye, and then I spent a second year working with the Fudusho family and learning to vat that indigo using natural historical techniques. And I studied at the time mainly shibori resist. So back to indigo really quickly. This is a gross generalization. Those of you who have studied a lot of indigo can point out all the exceptions to this. But really, when you look at indigo throughout the world, you could draw a line like this and divide it into 2 groups, tropical and temperate. These are sort of the tropical regions, tropical region indigo, and then you have temperate region indigo. The main centers of temperate region indigo were Europe with woad production and Japan. And interestingly enough, the methods that were developed and evolved in Europe and that developed and evolved in Japan the plants are different, but the composting process is almost identical. Again, they were working with their immediate environment to take what they had and transfer that color from plant to cloth. At a time where there was no communication between the two, the environments dictated similar outcomes. So they did that. I'm not going to go into the history of these. In Japan, they grew mainly Polygonum tinctorium, and that was mainly done in Tokushima, which is where I went to study as an apprentice. This is a question I'm asked all the time. You live in America, why are you growing Japanese indigo? Because I live here. Sorry, I pulled this map for a presentation I did in Japan. But that's me, that little A dot, that's us, Bloomington, 39.9. There we are on this map, that little blue dot. That's where I live. And to sum it up, basically, I use this much more time and labor-intensive method because it works with where I live. I do not live in the tropics. So I would have to add so much energy to the process to do the extraction method that's used in the tropics where I live that I choose to use this method that is tried and true, been used by people for hundreds of years in temperate regions. And this plays out not only in the growing and processing of the dye, but in the dyeing process as well, which I'll touch on. This is my house. That's where I grow indigo at home. So you can see, definitely not tropical. This is the field. I teach at Indiana University, and I grow indigo on campus as well, and have been very well supported by the university for doing this. The cycle of indigo growing, I'm going to jump into here. No one sells indigo seeds. You can't call it Burpee and be like, hey, send me 5 pounds of seed. So you start right about now. This is what the flowers look like. This is the field at home with my oldest. This was when he was 5 years old. To give you a sense of the size of the plants. The frost kills the plants. You gather the seed heads, winnow them, and then after the last, you plant in late March, early April. I plant in a greenhouse. My seedling beds. These are my younger 2, helping with planting. When the seedlings are about 6 to 8 inches tall, they are gathered, just sort of ripped out, and then transplanted to the field. This is transplanting on campus. At home, I basically do the work myself. My wife and I work together to do that. On campus, I set this up because when I started growing at home first. And I have neighbors who have horse farms, small-scale cattle farms, grow typical, small farm, 200 acres of corn and soy, things like that. And they saw us out there doing this, and they'd never seen this plant before. So they would stop. I said, what are you growing? What are you doing with this? Can you make money from this? What is this? And I realized this is a really great way of engaging my community. Like, people didn't know what this was. Here's this opportunity to invite in people who they just drive by, we might wave, but we'd never have a conversation. So I got some funding from the university to start a project called Into Growing Blue, where anyone who wants to participate is invited to come out and simply by working through this entire process, to not only potentially learn the process somewhat, but to really start to understand the energy that goes into making something. I do not believe on a fundamental level that the energy that I put into doing this or we put into doing this by hand is necessarily any different from the energy that goes into the mass manufacture of something. It's just a different type of energy. And when we look around at all the people who are unemployed, you start wondering, are we applying our energies in the best way, especially with the environmental destruction of some of these other forms of energy out there. So here we are transplanting. And then the indigo grows at home. When it's about waist height, it's ready for harvesting. The plants are cut at the base, and they're spread out to dry in the sun. Here we are. That was at home. This is harvesting on campus. As you can see, the ones, only the leaves contain the dye. So the ones in the back have just been spread out to dry. The ones in the front are fully dry. While we're waiting on campus when we're harvesting, to keep things fun and entertaining, we strip the leaves off, run them through a blender with some water, and dye silk. Dye is an incredible turquoise color with nothing else in there. And then the water, you're left with water and plant material, throw it back on the field. Here we go. So once the leaves are dry and brittle, we gather them up, put them in a pile, stomp them, pull out the stems, because again, the stems do not contain any indigo. And you're left with the dried indigo leaves. They're bagged. The stems are mulched and put back on the field as a mulch. And then I'm going to go through these really quickly. This is the construction of a shed for composting. And this is sort of maybe a more important picture. You see the floor here. The shed's just a shed. We had a lot of Amish in our area. These guys came out and put the shed up in 5 hours. Really incredible. I got there as they were arriving, and then I had to go to class. And 5.5 hours later, right at the end of class, I ran back, and they're like packing up. It's all done. It's pretty crazy. The main feature of this building is the floor, actually. And this is dug down about 6 feet and then backfilled with stone, larger stone on the bottom, then subsequently finer stone. And then on top of that, a layer of sand and then rice hulls. On top of that, more sand and then clay. And that clay is wet, as you see us doing here. It's wet, and it dries, and it's wet and dried and wet and dried. And then eventually we go through this. This took months and months of waiting for things to dry. That was my kids stopping in to see what I was doing. Dry, as you can see, big cracks initially, so we put in more clay. Again, more clay, more wetting. You get the idea. I'm going to skip through this. Then that floor gets tamped, packed down. You close off all the cracks. In order to do that, you tamp, and you wet it, and you tamp, and you wet it, and you tamp, and you wet it. And it takes weeks and weeks. And then finally finish the surface by hand. And then just a few weeks ago, we started composting all the indigo that we've harvested over the past few years. And this is done by taking those dried indigo leaves, mixing them with water, and leaving the pile to sit for a week. And then the next week, you take that pile, you break it all up. This is a hot composting process, so you need water and you need oxygen for it to continue to work. So once a week, you turn the pile. Just exposing it to oxygen in the air and adding more water. This process goes on, the composting goes on for 100 days. So we started in September, we'll be done in mid to late December. The pile shrinks down eventually to about 1/2 to 1/3 its original size. Thus, as you saw with the fresh leaf indigo dye on silk, you can dye protein fiber, mainly silk, with fresh leaves, but you will never get the very, very, very dark colors that you associate with indigo. I brought some samples of some runners that I've done up here so you can see the range of colors that's possible. What this process does that's different from an extraction method, this is not an extraction method, it's a concentration method. So you're taking the dye that's in the leaves, and by burning off the extra plant material through the composting process, you're concentrating the dye, and then you're then able to produce these much darker colors. So this is the pile right now. Actually, it's up to about 140 right now. Then once you've got that composted plant material, what do you do with it? I use large stainless steel vats in my studio. Before I can start a new vat, I have to get rid of the old one. I'm using composted plant material. I'm using wood ash, limestone, and wheat bran. So these are all things I can safely put on my field. I take the old vat and put it on the field, and it is a fertilizer for the field. For indigo dyeing, for any of you who have ever done this, you know there's three basic things you need. You need the indigo dye itself, you need an alkali because indigo is not soluble in water. You can't dissolve it in water. And you need reduction and oxidation. So I use wood ash for an alkali. I have heat with wood, a lot of my neighbors heat with wood, and then there's a couple of wood-fired ovens, restaurants with wood-fired ovens in town. Great source of wood ash. It's an industrial waste product for them. It gets sifted, you add boiling water to it, let it settle overnight. So there's when it's just been, this is about 40, 50 pounds of ash in there. Put in boiling water, stir it, let it settle overnight, and then you strain off that liquid. Excuse me. And then you repeat that 5 or 6 times. You take that liquid, and to it you add a little limestone, which is another alkali. So now we've got the alkali, then comes the next thing, the indigo itself. This is the composted indigo. It's mixed in there. I'm adding a little wheat bran for food that's been boiled in water. And you mix that all up. Okay? So now we have 2 of the 3 things that we need for the indigo dyeing. We've got the alkali, we've got the indigo. Now we need the reduction. And this is the brilliance of this type of indigo. It is composted plant material. This stuff is rich in bacterial life. Okay? So within it, it's sort of a closed system. It contains the bacteria that it needs for fermentation. You mix it all together after 3 to 4 days. It's kind of hard to see, but you start to get this metallic purple film forming on the surface. And when that happens, then once you get that, the indigo is being reduced, at which point it can adhere to the fiber. So here you see a test I did at like 8 in the morning and at 7 o'clock at night. Once the fermentation starts, the bacteria are aerobic. They eat the oxygen out of the vat, reduce the indigo, and it happens very quickly. So you can start dyeing. At this point, the vat's only half full, so you add more of the wood ash lye to fill it up. And then the dyeing itself is actually really, really simple. All you're doing is taking material, immersing it in this liquid, letting it sit in there for a while, and then you pull it out. And the indigo that is adhered to the fiber, the reduced indigo that's adhered to the fiber, oxidizes with oxygen in the air and turns blue. Anyone who's ever worked with indigo, it's a very magical process. And then darker colors are obtained by successive immersions in the vat. I use paste resist, which I'm not going to talk about because of time, but again, same thing, immersing the material in the vat, pulling it out, and repeating that process to get very dark colors, to build up color. And then the paste resist that I work with is also just a rice paste base, so it's water-based. When I soak it in water overnight, it washes off. Some examples of older work. I initially was trained in production craft in Japan and worked this way for a number of years. My wife is a weaver who weaves kimono and obi yardage. I came back to the States to study art. And became very interested in all these other things around indigo, or these things that converge in indigo as a material, a process, history, all these things, and wanted to work with those. So I've been doing these larger installations for the past 5-6 years that kind of, to me, get at some of that. And bringing the materials directly into the gallery. So this was a wall that was, I worked with students at University of Illinois, and we spent 4 or 5 days pinning indigo to the wall, and then it slowly dries and turns blue as part of the installation. Last year I was invited to develop a very large-scale project in Japan, and this is really where my thinking is right now. This was an incredible opportunity as part of the National Cultural Festival there. I was given a very large budget, and a staff to work with. And I started looking at holistically what is the tradition of indigo in Japan. And it's made up of the farmers, the processors of the indigo, dyers throughout the country who use the indigo from Tokushima, and the people who love indigo and use it at the end. These are like the 4 players that comprise this tradition. How could I bring them together in something? So I invited indigo dyers from all throughout Japan to dye, who used the indigo grown in this specific area to specific region to dye a length of cloth, their most meaningful shade of blue. These were very large lengths of cloth that they dyed. And so many people volunteered to be part of this, dyers. They sent the cloth back. We cut a strip off of each one, and these traveled around to sites of historical significance to indigo in the region. And at each site, visitors were invited to select their favorite shade of blue, and from that make a button that they could take with them and wear. So through this simple act of making this button, they're connected back through the people who dyed it all throughout Japan, back to the people who processed it, and to their own region where that indigo was grown. The second part of the project was an installation in a warehouse there where we brought all the larger pieces of cloth together. And the idea behind this was, I was working with a cloud form, and I was thinking about this again as I was flying in yesterday through the clouds. Clouds are fascinating things, much like a tradition. They're comprised of individual water particles that don't really have a substance in and of themselves. We see them, they take form, but they're constantly shifting, constantly moving, and as individuals, they are nothing. It's only in the collective experience of them that they become something. And this tradition is very much like that. If any one of those 4 main components of this disappeared, if people stopped growing it or if people stopped buying it, none of that tradition would not survive. Right now, I'm very excited because I received some funding last year. I'm going to be buying an indigo harvester. And this is another thing that I'm fascinated with is human scale. So in Japan, farming is done on a very small scale. 1.4 acres, or 1.25, 1.25 acres is what's considered historically what a family of 5 needed to survive. Okay, very different sense of scale. And there's a lot of small-scale farming equipment. So I'm buying one of these. It's a converted soybean harvester that will allow me to harvest a lot more indigo and lead to the next thing that I'm really interested in. I've started working with a local clothing company and dyeing some things for them. And this has made me aware of the potential to get this beautiful process out into the world and share it with more people. So these are some of the things I've been doing for them. The other thing I'm doing right now is I'm bringing these 2 things together. I'm developing another installation for Kennesaw State University and a new museum that they're building. And I've worked with the clothing designer in Bloomington to identify a material that I know will dye well, that they'll be willing to turn into shirts. And I'm dyeing 600 to 700 yards of this material, looking at exactly how much this many row feet of indigo in the field translates to this much dye, translates to this much color on cloth. And I'm using it for the installation, in which that's going to be the main focus. But then all of that material will be turned into shirts and go out into the world instead of just taking up space in my studio. So this is yards 142 to 150, something like that, from just 2 days ago in my studio. So I could go on and on, but we're out of time. Thank you.